Right. Okay, so welcome everybody. We are hosting an event tonight with a particular focus on retrofitting homes. The hosts, I guess, myself, Peter Moss, I'm a trustee of PCAN. Patricia, who is our project officer for our retrofit project. Ruth, who is our marketing officer, and Julian, who is the expert that is going to be doing most of the talking today, and will be answering questions towards the end as well. I thought I'd do a brief introduction as to who PCAN are. I would imagine, given that you all managed to find your way here, you probably know something already, but we're an environmental charity. We were established in December 2020 by a group of Petersfield residents with a focus on essentially trying to help Petersfield get to net zero over the coming years. I'm not going to be specific on timeline. And with a specific goal of recognizing that getting to net zero requires a contribution from national government, from businesses, from individuals, from local government, and we believe quite strongly from community groups as well. And by working together, we hope that we can actually sort of speed up the process. As a charity, we have been running a number of different projects over the time we've existed. Most recent ones, we've been running a fruit tree in every garden project, where we actually provided subsidized trees to over 400 people. We've worked with the local council to do to avoid cutting grass verges beside roads, so we get some wildflowers coming through. We actually staged the Petersfield Eco Fair, working very closely with the town council. We run an eco cafe on a regular basis, mostly Tuesday mornings up until now, although actually coincidentally tonight there is a drinks-oriented cafe, if you like, going on at the same time as this, which was an unfortunate scheduling problem that we hadn't quite picked up on until it was too late. We provide quite a lot of information to local residents on our website. I think one thing I would call out in particular is a very comprehensive recycling directory for Petersfield and the surrounding areas. And then we're running a project that we call Petersfield Area Super Homes, which is all around retrofitting or encouraging homeowners to retrofit their houses. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the evening. How are we funded? Well, we get funds from the Petersfield Town Council, funds from East Hants District Council, funds from the National Energy Foundation, who are themselves a charity and are sponsoring this Super Homes project with money that they have in turn got from the Energy Savings Trust. And we get some money from South Downs National Park as well. So a good sort of diverse set of income sources, which I think is hopefully going to sort of keep us going for a while to come. What is the Petersfield Area Super Homes project? Well, it's as I said, a program to help residents improve their homes' energy efficiency. And what we've done is we've done a number of things. Very specifically put some energy efficiency tips on the website, so simple things that you can do to keep your energy bills down. We have a section on funding and finance for retrofit. The point being that these things change quite quickly, and it's a little bit of a nightmare working out what you can get funding for as a homeowner. and grants and subsidies from the government. So we're trying to keep up to date with that and keep the website sort of as a source of that knowledge. But then the core part of this project is very much this partnership with the National Energy Foundation to provide whole house retrofit plans to homeowners. So what is a whole house retrofit plan? Well, it's essentially a professional independent survey tailored to the specific house that helps the homeowner to understand the best way to reduce their energy bills and in parallel to that, their carbon footprint. And that's what Julian's going to spend most of the evening talking about. We are also working, just so you're aware, with another charity, the Winchester Action on Climate Change charity, and they are running a very similar engagement process with the Winchester district, encouraging homeowners in that area as well. As part of that project, we're also carrying out some thermal surveys. So if you're interested in getting a thermal survey of your home, Patricia would hate me calling it a survey actually, because they're amateur sort of activities. But if you're interested in getting some thermal pictures of your home, you can register for that as well on our website, and we will then do our best to schedule a visit from a volunteer to come along and actually take some thermal images. Unlike many of PCAN's projects, the Superhomes project is not just focused on Petersfield. We make a sort of a big point of the fact that we're actually covering a much wider area. So we're covering all of East Hampshire, which is in itself quite a big area, all of the Chichester district of West Sussex, and some of the additional surrounding areas, for example, Haslemere. A lot of that working with other groups as well. So we work with climate community groups in Alton, in Borden, Brereton, Harting, Liss, Eco-Rother, that covers sort of the area between Petersfield and Midhurst, a group in Haslemere, and a range of parish councils as well. So we're trying to get out as widely as we can, and sort of encourage people to sign up, or at least start to ask questions. Just one very quick introductory topic on why we think this is an important project. Fundamentally, if you look at the carbon footprint for a town like Petersfield, but it would apply equally to Haslemere and Alton and a number of others as well, what you find is that somewhere in the region of 21, 22, 23% of the total emissions of the town come from homes, from houses. Much of this is for heating. And the amount of heating needed is quite often, is entirely dependent on the amount of heat that is lost from the house. So if your house is leaky, not insulated well, and so on, you will have to put more heat into it to maintain the heat, and therefore your energy bills and your carbon footprint will be higher as a result. Just to sort of be very clear on the scale of the problem, the National Housing Federation about a year and a half ago quoted as England's leaky homes are a bigger threat to climate than all of its cars. And the Department of Housing is on record as saying that the UK has some of the most poorly insulated housing stock in Europe. Almost 60% of our homes have substandard efficiency ratings of an EPC D or lower. I think the government over the next few years is going to be trying very hard to get that up to at least EPC C, wherever is practical. And then finally, the The Climate Change Committee, who I guess drive a lot of this activity across the UK, estimates that all rented and owned homes will need to be EPC band C or above by 2028 if we're actually to achieve net zero. And that would mean 15 million homes that need loft, wall or floor insulation, and a further 8 million that just need better draft proofing in some shape or form. So we're talking about a scale that is quite significant. But for us, the focus is on getting the ball rolling, I guess, getting homeowners interested in the area that we talked about, and hopefully engaging homeowners in starting that process. At the end of Julian's presentation, Patricia is going to take over and just give you a little bit of guidance as to how you can reach out to us and sign up for a retrofit survey if you're interested. But as a charity, what we provide is essentially an introduction service to professional surveyors like Julian, who's going to be doing the talking. We provide some independent advice, and we also provide a list of local installers if you want to get some of this activity done at some point as well. So enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Julian, if that's okay, who's the real expert in the room. And Julian, perhaps you can briefly introduce yourself before you start. I just reiterate, because of the large number of attendees, if you do have a question, feel free to pose it in the chat box at any point during the conversation, and we will try and pick those questions up at the end. We may not get through all of them, but those we don't, we'll try and get you at least an email response at some point in the next few days. So Julian, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. First of all, I need to say I've been suffering from a bad throat for a number of weeks. So if I'm taking copious drinks, it may be that I need a comfort break at some point. That'll be your opportunity as well. And I shall also be loading up with sweeties on a regular basis. So if you hear a clinking, it'll be a sweet against my tooth. And you might hear a rapper or two as well. Anyway, good evening to all of you. My name's Julian. I've specialized in sustainable design and consultancy in housing for over 20 years. My own very small company is called Abba Energy Ltd. I'm what's known as a PAS 2035 retrofit coordinator. And during the last 5 years, I've advised on roughly 500 homes. But I actually don't really favor the term expert. It kind of puts you in the bracket of knows everything, nothing more to see here. I actually learn something from almost every home I see. And I very much appreciate the traditional techniques used when many of our existing homes were constructed. And I have to say, I can still be amazed by the, shall we call it, playfulness of the average builder. Right, so what I'm going to do is share my screen and go to the slideshow. There we go. You should see on your screen in orange whole house plans and in black for retrofit. So we will make a start. Now, we've got quite a bit to get through. We will get to the whole house plan itself, but I actually need to put things in perspective for you. And there are a number of items in the presentation which will be unfamiliar. And at the end, we'll have a look at some no-nos, some dodgy work that I've seen, and also that's some of the disgraceful national work. So I'm a retrofit coordinator. What does that mean? Well, the retrofit coordinator was originally brought about after a couple of major events. In 2016, Sir Peter Bonfield produced this really groundbreaking report, which described an absolutely dismal state of affairs within the construction industry, particularly the refurbishment of existing homes, low standards of work, wrong materials, very poor customer service, and so forth. And this led to a totally new approach. And that approach was publicly available specification 2035, formed and led by somebody I know and whom I'm a big fan of. And with past 2035 came some new terms. Actually, they're wholly new professional roles, and there's a national shortage of most of them. So what's the retrofit coordinator's role? Well, the RC must identify and manage risks, must protect the concerns of the occupants and or the clients and the general public, and of course make sure that the targeted aims for the project are fulfilled. The retrofit coordinator is there to assess the entire house, including existing problems and their causes and remedies, but also to look at potential problems which may arise over the longer term from the use of incorrect materials, techniques, or technology applied previously, and then make recommendations followed by specifications for corrective and progressive improvement work. The retrofit coordinator then oversees work on site to ensure that, of course, the client is left with high quality results. So why would you bother doing retrofit? I mean, I'm 62, but many of my clients are not spring chickens like me. And some of them are probably thinking, well, why bother making changes here? You know, the place is fine as it is. It's too late for me to act. Why not leave it to the next people who move in? Frankly, I have more pressing decisions to make. However, what about this lot? What are they going to have to deal with? Have a look at this image, noting that it's maybe 2 years old, but I think it's still relevant for an understanding. The blue area is the current problem from existing homes. Green is the additional loading from the new homes that we're still building. And the brown arrow is the predicted CO2 total for 2050. The vertical bright red arrow is the challenge. There's a lot of work to do, and it won't be cheap. And as we race towards the target, we hope that all necessary work will be carried out, but actually it might not. Why would you bother? Well, for each household, there are a number of advantages. To an individual property, the advantages and changes will depend. Every home is different and must be treated as such. It's a good opportunity to go beyond building regulations, which is a do no worse than standard. It's important that changes are appropriate, of course, and sometimes professional compromise, wise professional compromise may be necessary. It helps to notably limit carbon dioxide emissions, making a global contribution to the reduction of risks from climate change, including, of course, more extreme temperatures, stronger winds, and heavier rain spells. We're getting from retrofit better living conditions and ventilation in the home, significantly improved air quality for better sleep, clearer thinking, reduced short and long-term illnesses. If we go wider than the individual property, we're looking, I beg your pardon, we're looking also at lower energy bills, and it becomes easier to, of course, to heat a property where you've got lower bills, lower costs, which allows more money in your pocket for other things. A key aspect, which is kind of less easy to measure, is comfort. Fewer drafts. I mean, I can't really calculate those, I can tell you that the draft proof, the draftiness of a property by measuring it, but your own comfort where you're sitting in the corner of the room, that's more difficult to measure. And you will, I suspect, over the last summer in particular, have had some experience of a property which has places which are significantly warmer than others. If you haven't, good luck to you. I know plenty of clients, particularly where they've got roof extensions that have been extremely warm in the summer, and by contrast, far too cool in the winter. If we have a look at existing properties, well, existing problems, that's maintenance, and we need to be cognizant of the fact that if we carry out sensible maintenance and we add energy efficiency measures, that improves the value of the home. Of course, retrofit work must be done in a coordinated manner, and it shouldn't block any work to be done in the future. If we go wider than the individual property, looking at a neighborhood, because you're reducing fossil fuel usage, you're improving local air quality. You're also reducing what's called a heat island phenomenon. It's particularly a problem in cities, especially where people have air conditioning units. They're pumping out the warmth from their individual property, and of course, everywhere else around them is getting warmer as a result. Not necessarily as a good thing. If we think even wider than that, nationally, there are significant aspects to be gained. So what is retrofit itself? Well, it can be, it's applicable to all existing buildings. Personally, I'm willing to bet that some brand new ones could do with some improvements. But improvement work should be suitable for that home, carried out by skilled site staff, overseen by good scrutiny, done in an appropriate order. A key aim of the improvement is obviously the home's energy efficiency, along with that the reduction of energy use, CO2 emissions, and energy bills. When we sit in a draft, we feel discomfort. A chair next to a single glazed window on a cold day, I suggest, is no one's first choice. So retrofit offers good, comfortable change. Everything we breathe is important, both externally, as this tragic case, and internally, as this one. So air pollution outside can be just as devastating as conditioned inside, obviously including internal air quality. But an undernoted benefit of retrofit is longevity. And that's on a path towards sustainability. And this is an image of one of the longest continuously occupied properties in the country. Somebody's been living here apparently since 1150. So I'm looking at retrofit for longevity of the property itself, not necessarily of the client. Of course, we all have to go somewhere eventually. Now, why do we need to treat each home differently? I mean, if you look at that image, you might think plenty of them are pretty well the same. Many of them identical. Actually, when we look at that in detail, that isn't actually true. Plenty of them were built to the same design. It might be tempting to think that next door is just the same as yours. It was built roughly the same year, or even that the matching pair of your semi-detached house looks identical from the outside. And because of that, that in energy efficiency terms, what goes on over there is pretty much the same as where you are. Actually, that's not true. And hence the title of the Peter Bonfield's report. No matter where we live, the history of work, changes, extensions, additions, subtractions will add up to a different story to be dealt with on its own merits. And the individual manner in which we use our homes differs according to our needs and daily routines. We work or we don't work. We like higher or lower temperatures. We go out a lot, we stay home more, we have people to stay, or a very busy household, or we have full command over our homes as single occupants. Maybe the kids are at home or about to leave for uni, or they've gone but left your loft full of stuff, and occasionally the grandchildren swing by. So every home needs to be treated differently. And what we use for that are energy efficiency measures. The improvements we make in retrofit are generically referred to as EEMs, energy efficiency measures. Insulation's perhaps the most obvious of these because heat loss is generally large and relatively easy to quantify. But all energy efficiency measures have their appropriate place. This table gives you a rough idea of key energy efficiency measures, but there are others. So what about the EEMs? Well, each has a different effect, a different impact on the building. Every one needs careful thought ahead, during installation, and if there may be a problem afterwards, monitoring later on. They require consideration of where it's going to go, what size is it, what does it look like, how do you control it, how is it compatible with other energy efficiency measures, because they do interact one with another, and those have resultant impacts on the energy itself. So each of them must be balanced against the other, and they need to be put in the correct order. It's not necessarily a logical order for the human mind, but there is an energy efficiency and a retrofit logic to it. And all retrofit ideas, aspects, instigations are related one to another. For instance, those three. And if you just read those through, see if you can work out for yourself how each one is related to the other in each sentence. There is a logic, for instance, from air quality to mold, because if the air is dense with humidity, you're providing moisture for mold to grow. If that humidity is settling on a cold surface inside of an external wall where there is wallpaper and wallpaper paste on top of a typical modern pink gypsum plaster. Well, as it happens, pink gypsum plaster, wallpaper paste, and wallpaper are pretty good items of food for a typical mold spore. So, excuse me, where does this take us to? I beg your pardon. In terms of the retrofit approach, we use what's called a whole house approach. It gives you a strategic viewpoint. Beg your pardon, I need to go back a slide. There we go. Our overall aim is, of course, retrofit, using those energy efficiency measures. And there is a key order in which to do things. We've got a purpose, retrofitting, but there is an order of import to be observed. And my first concern as a retrofit coordinator is always your health as the client. That has to come first. Next, the long-term health of the building. Nobody wants to live in a sick building or one that's falling apart or is damp or too cold. And only after those, finally, the import of energy efficiency itself, which we use by combining a range of energy efficiency measures. in order. Now, our requirement to use energy efficiency measures is basically, well, fix any existing problems first. Then you can perhaps look at some easy aspects. They might be changing a few light bulbs. Before insulation, there is a key phrase within retrofit. No insulation without ventilation. You must address ventilation first. Then you get to the external fabric, windows, floors, walls, roof. And then the building services, that might be the heating system, the heating controls, water, rainwater goods, and so on and so forth, including fixing any existing problems which are related to building services, like reworking the pipework or changing, for instance, from radiators to underfloor heating. And finally, you can move to renewables, which really, and it might be a bit of a derogatory term, but some of us call renewables eco-bling. It's the thing you see on the roof. It'll be the solar panels of some sort. That really ought to come last. The logic is that you reduce your impact first, then you provide what you need with the heating and energy. And finally, you either top up the requirement to where you want to get to, or if you have loads of renewables, you actually start making some money from that investment. That is what we call, as an overall approach, the whole house approach. So we need to fix current issues first, and that could be damp. You need to find the cause. If there's mold, I never advise people to clean using mold paint or bleach, because that has its own detrimental impact. And if you've got large areas, it needs to be professionally done. If there's failed brickwork, well, what's the reason for that? How do we address that? And then we can move on to easy aspects if they don't interfere with things later, which are going to happen later on, usually pretty straightforward. You know, a number of people still don't have thermostatic radiator valves on all of their radiators, except the one in the room where your room stat is, because they will disagree with each other. Then we can go to ventilation. You would often be forgiven for thinking that natural ventilation is fine and dandy. Actually, what we know from the last 20 years or so is that you can't rely on natural ventilation, just opening a few windows and having a few individual fans. We actually need to mimic our lungs by forcefully removing stale air and forcing in fresh air using a mechanical system, which guarantees the sort of breathing that we're used to through our lungs all of the time. You can have a demand-controlled mechanical extract ventilation system. I can tell you more about that later, or what's known as MVHR, mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. But that latter system is really for extremely low energy properties. Excuse me. Then we go to fabric performance, which is essentially the insulation for the key elements. And we're obviously looking at the external what's known as the external fabric. But we're also looking at holes in things, holes around pipes, holes around doors and windows. We're tightening up for the against the drafts. We need ventilation. We must have ventilation. We don't want drafts. They're two different things, not to be confused. There's also something called thermal bridging, and that's where you have gaps in the insulation. You might, for instance, be living in a property where there is insulation in the loft between the joists. Actually, if the insulation is not also over the joists, that is allowing thermal bridging through the joists. Then we look at building services. I mean, changing the heating system. If you want a heat pump, you'll need almost certainly to upgrade the electricity supply. You'll need heat for a space for the condenser for the hot water cylinder, as well as the condenser in the garden. And finally, we get to renewables, and there is a variety of those. Of course, that does have implications depending upon what work is required, what mood you're in. It's unlikely that you'll get everything done all at once. So things are likely to move forward in different phases. There are, excuse me, a set of opportunities. If you're going to have planned changes, then there are opportunities for energy efficiency measures to put in at that point. And these so-called triggers for change might be family events or thoughts about the property itself. Of course, those have implications. That's a repeat from the previous slide. My apology. So if we look at planned changes and the potential, this table gives you a rough idea of what sort of things you could be thinking about if you had a planned change in mind. There are opportunities to go, should we say, further than you might have been thinking, but definitely taking advantage, significant benefits, depending on what you're having done, obviously depending upon the budget, but of course also depending upon the upset, the implications for what you might have to move out of the property. If it's fairly extensive, you might have to move out yourself for a couple of days, a week, a couple of months. Depends what you're after doing. But there are important opportunities within retrofit, just piggybacking on some items of change that you might already be thinking about. And of course, many of these things will come across to you as significant challenges. You might even be thinking by now, okay, stop already, Julian, I've pretty well had enough. But it's up to us all to resolve those challenges. You don't have to do everything at once. The advantage of a medium-term whole house plan is that it sets out potential work, not just short-term, medium-term, but also for somebody else to do in the future. Leave it behind when you leave the property for the next people to think about, because the logic of work that can potentially be done has already been thought through. We're thinking about making changes over time, but any changes need to be done sensibly so that we're not negatively impacting future work. We don't want to have to redo things, and we need proper coordination of work while it's being done, as well as prior thought about what could be done and in what order. Towards this, prior to the retrofit report, you actually need to have a retrofit survey done, and that's looking at some key aspects. That's a major list that covers some of the items. And there are others. Now, these all feed into the retrofit coordinator's report. It's important to have this level of detail. Some surveys will be done by a domestic energy assessor who's an energy specialist and visits and takes photographs, measurements and so forth, produces reports on behalf of the retrofit coordinator presented to the retrofit coordinator. So the RC can use that information in the whole house plan. What's the whole house plan? So here we are, and everything I've given you so far is relevant to what goes into a whole house plan, which is a report written by a PAS 2035 qualified retrofit coordinator. All right, so what's in it? Well, it needs to state the things which are important to you as the client. So aspects of import for you will have come out of conversation either on the phone or in person with the retrofit coordinator or the domestic energy assessor. And there'll be current issues which you're aware of, perhaps aspects of discomfort and ideas you're thinking, well, we really do want to do the roof extension this summer. But it also needs to include the important points noted by the retrofit coordinator during the survey. There are some aspects which will be more important than others, some things which definitively must be addressed as soon as possible. I'll show you an example of one of those a bit later on. But it also has to give key data as the results of calculations, including those in front of you now. And as client, you need to be able to compare the existing with the proposed. So estimates for carbon dioxide, energy costs and energy usage will also be there. And then, of course, the estimated results of the work suggested by the retrofit coordinator. Again, giving you, relatively speaking, comparative figures for before and after. Now, I should say that the calculation method used is a national calculation method known as RDSAP, Reduced Data Standard Assessment Procedure. It has never been a hugely accurate program. It was never intended to be. So the estimates given in whole house plans are generally to be thought of as relative. So if you had an improvement, for instance, percentage difference between before and after, the percentage difference might be better applied if you plugged in your own fuel bills. So for instance, if your fuel bill was 150 quid and the report said it was 300, so then double the figures and double those for the comparison. So you get a relative percentage change as an advantage. But the point is, and I've missed some of the key aspects out here for privacy purposes. I don't want to give everything away in one night. The key aspect is that what you're getting is a good look at where the gains and losses will be in relative terms. You'll note that on the left-hand side of the bar graph at the bottom, you actually get a heat pump efficiency gain from installing a heat pump, whereas previously you were suffering from some heating efficiencies from an old system. And usually the retrofit report and suggestions are presented in 3 phases, and the order of work follows the logic that we saw earlier. So you're getting simple measures first. Of course, ventilation is key, and then perhaps some loft and roof insulation. And that adds up to a certain cost and a certain energy rating and resultant fuel bill changes. So your fuel bill, for instance, should be going down by 16%, and your carbon at this stage only going down by 4%. But those figures change at the next stage, so we start to get a better gain of carbon. I beg your pardon, a better gain on the fuel bill of 18%. And again, I've missed out some of the key figures in the middle, but you can see the logic. We start to tighten up the envelope. We've already got our ventilation in place, so now we can start draft proofing against the chimneys, changing doors and windows, and perhaps adding cavity wall insulation at that stage, because where the cavity wall insulation is installed, we want to be looking at the junction of the walls and the windows and the doors, so the insulation is contiguous. We don't have gaps. In phase 3, you might be adding floors, because at that stage, perhaps you're thinking about adding the air source heat pump and finally the photovoltaics. Well, that's coming much later on, and phase 3 might actually take place during the next tenancy, or in a couple of years' time, when you want the pools or a more suitable aspect has come around. Also included needs to be a discussion section. We call this a technical review, and it sets out things to be aware of, maintenance aspects, easy wins from insulating pipe work, and so forth. And this gives some useful advice on existing issues to be dealt with. And of course, on the energy efficiency measures suggested. And finally, towards the end is also include a tabulated list of the energy efficiency measures. Again, I've left out the key aspects here, but you're getting a list, a copy of the list that your retrofit coordinator has chosen from. Now, this list will have been spat out by the software, the energy efficiency software we use, giving sensible suggestions. But that gives you a chance to look at some of the different choices that the retrofit coordinator, together with yourself, has made. We issue reports in draft form so that you can have a good look, mutter and moan to yourself, and then complain or compliment the retrofit coordinator during a call, and appropriate changes can be made to the report. Now, for some more good news, the EU energy label system is still working, and this is a really simple method of starting to reduce your energy demand. It applies to a number of different electrical items, some of which perhaps you weren't aware of, including, of course, for your next car service, tyres, a thing to think about. Although disappointingly, the higher rated tyres for fuel, noise and braking are still not really available. But when it comes to light bulbs, have a good look at the ones you might be choosing next time, because although they may look identical, actually they can have significantly different energy efficiency performance. Now, here's one piece of advice I offer to all clients, and specifically because water is the most challenging and potentially the most damaging influence on buildings. It's to upgrade guttering. It's worth getting the best affordable guttering, because cheap materials like UPVC are weak and only get weaker over time. But my important point to you is that increasing the capacity of your rainwater drainage goods, gutters and downpipes, is becoming really key. I don't know if you've noticed, but I certainly have in the last couple of months. The rainwater spells are really testing the gutters. Okay, so how are we doing for time? Time is moving on. We're not doing too badly, I think. So I'm going to give you some of my observed retrofit crimes. This is by no means an extensive section or definitive, it's certainly not a definitive list. But can you spot the issue in this loft? Well, it's uninsulated pipework above the insulation layer, or as I would term it, uninsulated pipework outside of the thermal envelope. You're keeping the heat in the house. You don't particularly want to keep the loft warm, but for goodness sake, that pipe is at risk of freezing and bursting, and then you'll get indoor rain. Another one. So this is part of what I mentioned earlier. This is what looks like ordinary loft insulation. But hang on a minute, where are those drops of water on the loft floor coming from? Let's have a closer look. Oh my gosh, it's indoor rain. And why? Excuse me. Well, if we have a look at the rafters, a close look, and we measure their moisture content, it should be around about 9% indoors within the envelope, within the insulated envelope where you're sitting now. But in a cold loft, it would be acceptable for wood moisture content to be somewhere around 12%, maybe a bit higher. I measured these rafters. The lower one was pretty bad. The upper one was absolutely soaking wet. And the reason? Well, it's because when the insulation was put in the loft, it was stuffed down into the eaves. And actually, what needs to happen is that you need to leave a suitable gap on opposing sides of the loft at the eaves level to allow air movement through the loft over and around the structural roof timber, so keeping it suitably dry and in good condition. Now, the keen amongst you might spot another potential faux pas here. In many cases, electrical cables need to be run over the top of insulation, not underneath. Otherwise, they heat up and can become a fire risk. Now, this isn't the case with all cables. It does depend on what current they are carrying, and electricians can advise further on the finer points. Now, in this case, I've placed a tape measure, which is a part of the standard house survey. You need to measure the thickness and note the type of insulation that you see. I'm getting a measure of the insulation, or at least I'm getting a measure of the insulation behind the tape measure. In front of the tape measure, there's just boarding with no insulation. That's a gap. That's a mistake. There should be insulation contiguous right across the whole loft, including the loft hatch itself, which should be insulated, and it should be draft sealed. So here's another one. We've got a kitchen extract fan, and it's passing up through what you might think of as relatively harmless duct. Actually, ductwork, good ductwork should be a smooth-sided circular section, rigid duct, not a flexible one. The flexible ones don't last. But if you are going to have flexible duct and you go into the loft and link it to something like this, good luck. So you can see the junction of the flexible aluminium duct where it's joined to the flexible plastic duct coming up from below. It's been squashed almost flat. That really restricts the airflow. And at that point, you're going to get noise. You're also going to get a rapid decrease of the speed of the air, which means you're going to drop particles of oil, which is further going to slow down and drag on the airflow, increasing noise, decreasing the efficiency of the fan, increasing the wear and tear on the bearings in the fan, and failing the fan early. On top of that, wherever ductwork, ventilation ductwork passes through a cold space, it needs to be insulated. That's not insulated at all. Here's an example of external wall insulation. And we can see that the external wall insulation has been placed so thick, it really hasn't been thought about. It's gone so close to the window, actually you can't open the window all of the way. Another aspect, actually from the same house, you've got ducting, beg your pardon, you've got drainage pipe work, which is halfway buried into the wall. That creates what's called a thermal bridge at the point of the pipe work. So you've got the insulation protecting the wall, but where the pipe work sits against the wall, you've got no insulation, which would usually mean long-term that on the inside face of that external wall, you'll have a patch of cold condensation and mold, broadly speaking, the shape of that pipe. There was a national case some years ago where in Preston, some pretty awful insulation was done. And here again, you've got a lack of contiguity of the insulation. The insulation hasn't been run up the outside of the wall to meet the roof insulation. The guttering and pipe work, the swan neck pipe hasn't been extended over the top of the insulation. Actually, what should have happened was the gutter should have been moved out to allow for the insulation right up the wall. And again, there's a gap on the right-hand side. The results internally for many of the houses in Preston was really bad news. You need to do things properly. This is what happens when you fail really, really, really badly. One of the most shocking aspects of retrofit. So I think I'm done. I'm not sure I've missed anything critical. I'm sure you'll be keen to point out if I have. Go ahead with your questions.
So I've only noted one question on the chat at the moment from Wayne, who asks, why would I need to upgrade my electricity supply if I install a heat pump? And he comments his house is not old, it's 2015.
Heat pumps take quite a heavy current, and most properties are not suited to that current. It's an electrical question. If you have a really old fuse box, like individual fuse wire, you'll definitely need to upgrade that. But heat pumps make a heavy draw on the electricity demand, and most properties don't have fuses which are large enough to take that load. It's something you can easily check with your electrician.
Okay. Anne is asking how big a gap should be left between the insulation and the eaves in the loft.
Right. You can get what are called, what are they called? I think they're called eaves boards. They're basically V-shaped boards. The V gets jammed, they're plastic formation. The V gets jammed into the eaves, and you can then force insulation into the V. The top of the V section is actually ridged, and that allows a flow of air beneath the soffit of the roof, up and between the rafters. They are pretty readily available, and so we're not really talking about a dimensionable gap between the eaves and the rafters, the insulation and the eaves, if you form it with that proprietary eaves board. Let's see. I think the recommended dimension is a continuous 10 to 20 millimeters. Don't quote me. I'd have to look that up in the building regulations. But if you look in your loft tomorrow after dark and you see no gap, pull some insulation back from every part of the eaves until next morning you can see daylight, or actually, come to think of it more sensibly, do it during the daytime.
Okay, I'll come back on the cost one because I'm covering that later. Underfloor insulation, what would you recommend? Are we talking Celotex type style, or for example, could rock wool style be used?
Right, this depends on your floor makeup, on the construction of the floor itself. Excuse me. So if you have a suspended timber floor, you can use a mineral wool. You can also use a wood fiber, which is very similar material, but lasts longer. If you were to go with a material like that under a suspended timber floor, what you would do is wrap a membrane over and between the floor joists. Then you would stuff the insulation in that nest, and then over the top you can put a slimmer layer of insulation and then your floor finish. or if there's room in the solum under the floor joists for somebody to crawl or reach or even stand, you can add insulation under the joists themselves. A suspended timber floor construction is going to be one which is vapor permeable. So using suitable materials like those, insulation materials like those I've mentioned, will be important. If you've got a solid floor, you can use different material like the one mentioned previously, but you have the option of using any material which is not vapor permeable. You could use a vapor permeable insulation as well, but you have the option of using a material which is not vapor permeable. For instance, a spray-on foam, a foam board. If you're close to the ground, if you're next to the earth, you need to use an insulation which is also water impermeable. So for a solid floor, you've got different options. You can, if you're changing floor levels anyway, and thinking of adding underfloor insulation, I beg your pardon, underfloor heating, you could, for instance, take out the whole floor. You could strip out the screed, which is typically 80 millimeters thick. You could then also proceed to take out the whole of the reinforced concrete floor itself. I mean, unless you're really keen to add a lot of insulation, that's quite a bit of extra work. And floor heat loss is not as great as walls or roofs, so arguably not necessarily always worth it. But digging out some of the floor, adding insulation, and then putting back your floor finish, or adding underfloor heating pipe work, and then your floor finish. You can, of course, leave the existing floor as it is and add something on top. I mean, if you were taking off the floor finish, so renewing a timber floor finish, so laminated floor. Problem with laminated floors is you can put them down once, but once you take them up, you'll never get them down in the same state. So if you take up a laminated floor, you could at that point add insulation and then a new floor finish. However, that means that the relative levels of your doors, staircase, thresholds changes. So then you need to make changes at those points to those particular aspects and structures. That's doable. Of course, anything's doable, but it may or may not be worth it. It really does depend on what you're looking for, the state of the existing floor, whether there is or is not insulation already, and what is beneath the floor finish in terms of the actual structure. That needs looking into on an individual basis to see what we're dealing with. But there are a number of options. Pretty well anything is possible. Some things are too much bother.
Okay, there's a few more on floors here as we're talking floors. So Anne has asked, I think you've covered some of it anyway. She's asked, I'm having laminate floor put in a downstairs room with an old timber floor. Should I use this opportunity to put in underfloor insulation? Won't this just stop the air circulating under the house, leading to damp?
Yeah, I mean, subfloor ventilation is extremely important. You can, of course, decide to take up an existing suspended timber floor and replace it with a solid floor. That's a perfectly valid choice. Needs to be thought about carefully where the insulation meets the walls and what happens at those junctions. But if you are if you're addressing an existing floor, definitely take the opportunity to examine the state of the existing floor conditions, the supporting timbers below the floor. If you're not sure, get an experienced chartered surveyor to carry out a floor survey and have a look underneath. If you get a builder to have a look, they will find an issue that they will be able to charge you to deal with. So get an independent worker on working on your behalf. Have a good look, instigate any of the necessary changes. So for instance, I was in a property this morning where the original raised timber floor had one single subfloor ventilation grille only on one side of the property. and it should have had 2, arguably 3, on both sides, on opposing sides, to allow the fresh air to move through and keep the timbers supporting the floor dry enough. So I would say definitely, I mean, strictly speaking, if I use my sustainability hat, I wouldn't necessarily think about a laminated floor. I might instead think about having a good look under the floor, ensuring it's suitably ventilated, making any structural repair changes necessary, getting the whole thing insulated, and adding underfloor heating at that point, and then putting perhaps a reclaimed floor finish on top, secondhand teak or oak or pine timber, you know, knot-free pine timbers, whatever your choice. Yes, a good opportunity to have a good look below, definitely.
And for suspended floors, timber structure, would you recommend multi-foil insulation on top of engineered boards?
Absolutely not. I have it in my own house. It was put in by a very much mistaken builder as something he thought he could charge for well before my time of influence. So particularly the type of silver bubble wrap foil that is designed only for use in wall cavities. Its effect, its positive impact comes from sitting against a wall with then an air cavity on the other side of it. I see no excuse for using it anywhere else. By the way, I should say also that the multifoil insulation, which has layers of silver and then sort of white fabric, soft fabric in between, this is a personal view. My view is that that actually doesn't work. Technically speaking, if you try to prove how it works using one particular debatable, I have to say professionally, method of proving that it works, it shows that it works. If you use the only other acceptable method of proving insulation, it doesn't work. My personal view is that those multifoil insulations are, again, I stress this is a personal view, they belong in the snake oil industry.
Great. Okay, moving on. John has a question. Does the survey check the need for cavity wall insulation using a boroscope or similar?
Not normally. That's usually carried out by a chartered surveyor who will take the time to have a good look round in a variety of locations. I carry a boroscope with me when I do surveys. I rarely have time to use it. It can be handy for me to see things where I really can't access. But in terms of cavity wall, checking the cavity in a wall, no, that requires intrusive work, drilling 8 to 10 millimeter holes in various locations and having a look. That's not within the retrofit coordinator's remit. Some of them might choose to do it as a service. That's not something I offer as a service. I have looked into cavity walls as a separate aspect on properties in the past, but in my normal everyday work as a retrofit coordinator, that's not something I do. You would leave that to get a separate survey done by a specialist. Again, somebody working directly on your and only on your behalf.
Okay, Sarah is asking, does the retrofit coordinator help you find reputable installers? This is often a concern for many people.
Actually, that's offered as part of the service by PCAN and WINAC as part of the kind of after sales help through the National Endy Foundation head office.
Yeah, and I can touch on that a little bit later. How are we doing? Claire asks, is there a limit to the volume of extensions relative to the original home for a survey?
For a survey, no, when we do surveys, we look at everything within the heated envelope. So if you've had an extension downstairs to the basement and one out halfway into the garden and a loft extension conversion, and it's all within the one property, that's what's included.
Yeah, clearly the size and the complexity may affect the price that is charged, but they can all be surveyed.
Yeah.
Tom is asking, solar PV at the moment makes good economic sense so long as the roof is in good condition. That could be more economically compelling than, for example, expensive internal or external insulation. So this may be the preferred early measure, contrary to the order in the plan. I think he means that customer preferred option.
Yes, I see this a lot. It's never been my advice and it never will be, but you're the client. You can make whatever choice you want. I go by the strict logic of reduce your requirement first, then supply what you need, and then add on the bling later. Actually, there is something else to consider, and that is that the insulation will be there for 50, 80, 100 years. Your solar panels are never going to last that long. They'll need replacing more often than that.
Okay, and Nick is asking, cavity wall insulation, any things to be aware of? Heard horror stories regarding damp. Is it simpler to use external insulation?
Depends on the property. Yes, I too have heard, read, and occasionally I'm still amazed at the stories I read about cavity wall insulation and where it's failed. It can be very improperly installed. A property I dealt with, a very early cavity wall property I dealt with, 1890, I think it was, had cavity wall insulation injected. What you do when you install cavity wall insulation is you drill holes in various points through the external leaf of the twin leaf cavity wall construction. So you're drilling a hole through the outside brickwork in various locations. That hole needs to be big enough for you to put what's called a lance into that hole. It's basically injecting from a van load of insulation supplied by a pump through the lance, through the hole, into the cavity wall. And you do that in various locations until the cavity is filled up to that point. But if you're a cavity wall installer in a real hurry, you might find that the hole isn't necessarily big enough, the one that your fellow workers just drilled in a few places, and you can't quite get the lance in. So as I witnessed in this particular property, you ram the lance in so hard that the back of the brickwork comes off. That's one aspect. Careful, considerate work by experienced builders who are not going to run away tomorrow. The appropriate insulation is key. So I mentioned vapor permeability earlier. What that means is the ability of moisture to move from the inside of a property through a wall to the outside of a property and back again. There's nothing wrong with that. Moisture movement is really, really common in buildings. But if you've got a cavity wall which was designed to allow moisture to move through it, as a traditional build was, built with soft bricks and lime mortar, if you then introduce an insulation which stops that moisture movement, don't be surprised if there are problems. So for a traditionally built property with soft bricks and lime mortar, you ought to have insulation in the cavity which allows for the movement of moisture, which is vapor permeable. Now, having said that, it may be that you instead go with external, that you go with external wall insulation, and in which case it kind of doesn't really matter what you fill the wall with. Get the most efficient insulation you can, because you're going to be insulating on the outside of the wall as well anyway. What you wouldn't do is externally insulate and then leave the cavity empty. So there are things to watch out for with cavity wall insulation, yes. I should say at this point, there is good guidance on the BEIS, B-E-I-S, government department website. They give advice on, I think they're up to date now with underfloor insulation, roof insulation. I think they've done some on wall insulation. And I know several of the people that wrote those reports and did that work. They have a lot of detail in them. They're well worth referring to.
Okay, I'm conscious of time here. There's two more that have popped in. One is just asking about thermal wallpaper. Does it work?
Why bother? It's a bit like putting a t-shirt on when you're going to the Arctic. You almost might as well not wear the t-shirt. It can cause issues in terms of placing a piece of vapor impermeable insulation against a vapor permeable wall. Yes, you will see a difference because you will change the temperature of the internal face of that wall. So you will see a reduction of condensation to that wall. So I can't say it does nothing, but the impact is minimal in energy efficiency terms. It's too thin.
Okay, and Sarah's question, the last one I'll take tonight. She comments most funding doesn't include replacing doors and windows as a primary measure. I think I read this was because they don't have as great an impact on reducing energy loss as you would get from installing insulation. Do you agree?
Yes, absolutely. If you're going to go for a really, really, really well insulated window, it will cost you quite a lot of money. It'll be triple glazed. It'll be super duper. It'll last a good long time. It'll be a pleasure to use. But the heat loss through doors and windows is typically significantly greater than the heat loss through well insulated walls, floors and roofs.
Okay, I'm going to stop the questions there because
Can I just ask one? Is it possible just to ask what you would use for flat roof insulation?
Well, that depends on the construction of the roof. You could use mineral wool between and over rafters. You could use a foam board. That's a bit more complex. I can't actually give you a definitive answer because it depends upon the construction of the roof, which could be one of three things. It could be warm roof, it could be a cold roof, or it could be an inverted roof. I'm afraid I don't have time to go into details of what those individually mean.
That's all right.
But again, if you're unsure before getting quotes, get a surveyor to have a look and give you advice, or your local building control officer, if you can get them on the phone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for your questions. Thank you, Julian, for incredibly interesting talk, and I think we've all learned quite a lot there. I would just like to close off the meeting tonight with a few brief points about PCAN and how we can help you on this journey. So you've heard from Peter earlier who we are and what we do, but in particular around this whole area of home retrofit and home energy advice, we sort of have a three-pronged offer. So the first thing is our simple energy saving tips. And we've built up a bit of a database on our website of ideas from very simple behavioral changes that I'm sure many of you will have heard of, things like turning off your appliances, turning down the thermostats, through to draft proofing your house, choosing low energy appliances, and then right up to the sorts of changes that Julian's been talking about tonight, about adding insulation to your home, other home upgrades. So there's a raft of tips and ideas for you there on our website. Peter mentioned at the start that we give information about the grants and subsidies that are available. There's a lot of confusion in the public domain about what is on offer. We've had all sorts of things in the past, green home grants and feed-in tariffs and all sorts of things that have come and gone. It's quite hard to keep up with the terminology. And so what I have tried to do over the time I've been involved in this project is to keep up to date with what is available both locally from our district council and also the national offering from the government. So I can signpost you to the schemes that might be of relevance to your particular situation. And then if you do have money to invest in some home improvements and you like the idea of the whole house retrofit plan that Julian's been mentioning today, then we can link you up with somebody like Julian. We have a group of retrofit coordinators who all work on the project, and they can come to your home, do the survey and produce that bespoke report for your property. What's the benefit of doing it through us? Well, I believe our subsidised plans are very good value for money. The costs range, unless you're on benefits, in which case I can have a separate conversation with you, but the standard cost for the plan is between £250 to £600, depending basically on the size of your house. Also included within the project is 1 year's membership of the NEF Super Homes network. And this is a network of people who are interested in retrofitting their homes. NEF provide regular newsletters and webinars like this on topics of interest. They've got a Facebook group and they have links to suppliers and installers as well. And NEF also employ a retrofit coordinator to work on the project who can provide a bit of follow-up help after you've had your whole house plan done. And NEF have their own Super Homes Design star rating that measures the carbon efficiency of your home once it's retrofitted, so you can compare that to other people's homes or see what the improvement is in your own home if you get the whole house retrofitted according to your plan. So that is broadly speaking what we're offering. If that's of interest and you don't already do so, please sign up for our PCAN newsletter. You can do that on our website, which is www.petersfieldcan.org. Or if you want any more information about the project, if you're interested in following up with a whole house retrofit plan, or if you just want to have a conversation with me about funding that's available, then do drop me an email. And my address is superhomes@petersfieldcan.org. And I think that was probably all I had to say. Peter, had you any last words before we close out the meeting?
No, I think that's pretty comprehensive, to be honest. The only thing I would add perhaps is that we do have an installers list that we give out to people that have had plans. The installers list is not sort of a set of recommendations, but they are installers where we know they are appropriately qualified, and we've not heard any horror stories. So I mean, essentially, that's available, and it's a good deal easier than actually trawling through the internet to try and find a list for yourself. That's the only thing I would add. Thank you very much for your time tonight. As Patricia said, if you've got any further follow-up questions, do reach out to us on the website or through that Superhomes email address. We'd be more than happy to answer questions, and I hope that was useful. Many thanks for taking the time to attend, and hopefully you'll go away having learned something and be able to do something to your house to make it more efficient. Many thanks. Good night.